generally distinctively human. He has to begin his inquiry by asking about himself, not only to reveal the reasons why he is engaging in such an inquiry, but also to explain what has enabled him to discover what no one else has seen or understood before. More explicitly than either Oedipus or Socrates, in his Confessions, Augustine raises the questions, who am I? And what kind of being am I? However, both the way in which he seeks to answer these questions and the answers to which he comes differ markedly from those of his predecessors. Whereas Oedipus sought to discover who he was by interrogating witnesses in a public assembly, and Socrates examined the opinions of others in private conversations, Augustine famously turned inside himself. We have become so accustomed to thinking about the search for self-knowledge as an essentially introspective endeavor that we may no longer recognize how seriously Augustine departed from the Platonic philosophy he presents as a step, but only a step in his own journey. Nor may we appreciate the originality of the autobiographical form in which he presented his thoughts. In order to describe the way he came to feel God's love and his utter dependence upon it, Augustine had to invent a new literary genre. The form in which he presents his thoughts and feelings up through his conversion to Catholicism and decision to return to Africa to become a bishop is very complex. In the first 9 books of the Confessions, he relates his feelings and thoughts at each stage of his development, simultaneously from 2 different perspectives. He describes what he felt and thought at the time. However, he also explains what he did not know then, but has subsequently come to appreciate, how God providentially led him, despite his own, his parents, his comrades, and his would-be teachers' desires and ignorance, to experience, recognize, and embrace God's love. Augustine can present his life from the dual perspectives of what he thought and felt at the time and what he has come to understand about it later, because, as he explains at the end of the account of his life up through his conversion in Book 10, everything he has experienced and knows is contained in his memory. Recapitulating what he has found in his memory with the help of God, Augustine concludes, "Not in all these things," and I'm quoting, "that my mind has traversed in search of you." It is not in the world or himself, in what he has sensed or thought, has he been able to find, and again, any sure place for my mind save in you, in whom all that is scattered in me is brought into one. He explains, "Sometimes you," and this is God, "admit me to a state of mind that I am not ordinarily in, a kind of delight, which could it ever be made permanent in me would be hard to distinguish from the life to come. But by the weight of my imperfections, I fall back again unwillingly." Having had a fleeting experience of the happiness of a being who is at peace because his thoughts and feelings are united, Augustine has come to know what he truly desires. That love or desire gives direction and thus unity to his life. However, as a mortal, he continues to be tempted by his carnal desires for pleasure and praise. As a result, he lives in a constant yearning, which he recognizes will not end until he dies and is reborn. As many commentators have noted, Augustine presents his personal history as exemplifying a Christian understanding of the human condition. However, although his confessions are heavily interspersed with phrases quoted from both the Old and New Testaments, Augustine's account of his own education and endeavor is based not on a personal revelation or a miracle, but on kinds of experiences other human beings can have as well. These experiences include chance encounters with specific individuals, which obviously can't literally be replicated, as well as his readings and thoughts. The personal, emotional character of his presentation makes it resemble poetry or fiction more than philosophy. But the first person narrative, along with the incorporation of other known persons, events, and places, distinguishes his selective but factual self presentation from a fictional drama. He tells his life story not only to prevent himself from falling into despair, but also to present an encouraging example to others. Augustine's view of the human condition is not tragic. There is, after all, the promise of salvation. But his view is not, strictly speaking, philosophical either. Augustine emphasizes the importance of his reading of the Platonists, or the role they had in leading him to convert to Catholicism. But he states just as clearly that he could not find the comfort he sought in the works of philosophers. His confessions contain as much philosophy as they do, because he could not, in good conscience, publicly affirm that he believed anything he did not think was true. Moreover, the God he had believed in since childhood could see what was in his head and heart. He had to turn inward and examine himself, therefore, in order to understand how he had benefited from God's goodness, as well as how he continually fell short. He needed to recognize the non-corporeal character of his own thought and to take account of the pleasure he received from discussing ideas with his friends. Like Plato's Socrates, he needed to learn the limits not only of his own knowledge and powers, but also those of the other men who claimed to be wise. So far as contemporary scholars have been able to determine, the only Platonic dialogue Augustine actually read was the Timaeus, in which Socrates is not the main philosophical speaker. But in seeking self-knowledge and acknowledging what he does not know as well as what he does, Augustine resembles the character named Socrates Plato portrays in many other dialogues. Like Socrates, Augustine examined the opinions of others, not only in personal conversations, but also as those opinions were communicated in writings. However, Augustine also questions his own intentions and motives much more than Socrates does. Socrates sought knowledge of what is truly good for human beings and found that the conversations he held with others about the true character of human excellence constituted the best possible form of human existence. Like Augustine, he concluded that the search for wealth and honor that moved other ambitious human beings, like Alcibiades and Critias, to seek political preeminence was not worthwhile. Augustine found God's command to be continent the greatest obstacle to his becoming a Catholic. Unlike the seemingly ascetic Socrates, he did not find that his desire for truth was sufficiently strong to free him from his carnal desires. Precisely for this reason, Augustine appears to be more human. He claims to love God, but only seeks to know him. And not knowing God, Augustine acknowledges, he does not entirely know himself. The only thing he claims to know for certain is that God will never give way to temptation. Augustine is by no means sure that he will not. Even after he converted, Augustine presents himself as a flawed human being. He hopes for eternal salvation because he thinks that God has demonstrated his care for Augustine by providentially acting to enable him to see the truth for himself. Augustine's love of God has not been aroused the way Socrates suggested a human being's eros might lead him to a temporary glimpse of the beautiful in itself, that's in the Symposium, or by his perception of the beauty of the soul of another human being, as in the Phaedrus. Augustine loves God because he has come to believe God loves him and wants to be loved in return. However, that love is not reciprocal like that of Socrates' lovers. God can see into Augustine's soul the way no other being can, and has charitably sought to relieve the misery he finds there. Augustine has not earned that love. Its unearned quality is indeed what makes God's love so wonderful and mysterious. Because he combined a Platonic conception of the purely intelligible, eternally unchanging character of the Creator with the Christian conception of a God who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, Augustine's teaching has been dubbed Platonism for the people by both its critics, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, or its admirers, Pierre Hadot. The truth Augustine proclaims, especially concerning his love for God, that grew out of his experience of God's providential love for him, is not the preserve of a few sages. Thanks to the publication of God's words in the Bible, it is available to anyone who will listen and believe. That's much more democratic than ancient philosophy. The problem with this belief, later philosophers like Rousseau and Nietzsche have pointed out, is that it radically devalues life here and now. Augustine urges his followers to minimize their desires as much as they can and to obey the established authorities on earth, awaiting their release and salvation by God in the next life. But as Hannah Arendt points out in her reworked dissertation on love and St. Augustine, his emphasis on the central importance of one's love of God also weakens if it does not entirely eviscerate the love a human being can have for other faulty beings like himself, or even for himself. The extension of God's love and his command to love others to all believers, if not to all human beings generally, necessarily weakens the affection and compassion a human being can feel for others or experience from others by diluting it. Augustine expresses his love for others by trying to communicate the truth he has learned to them. And that attempt made him become increasingly dogmatic after he became bishop. He felt justified in using force to save his fellow citizens or believers in the true faith from erring by persecuting heretics. Instead of promoting peace on earth, such persecutions provoked violent reactions. Arendt argues that the distinction Augustine drew between the eternal truth possessed by God and the time-bound human perception of things pointed to an essentially different understanding, not merely of love, but of the human condition more generally. However, it was only after his insight into the temporal character of human existence was severed from the Platonic metaphysics to which he had joined it, that Augustine's understanding of human being as being in time could become the basis of a new, fundamentally historical understanding of what is distinctively human. At least my attempt at a summary of the beginning and the end.
Thanks, Catherine. And apologies for interrupting you there in the middle. I, of course, forgot to start the recording for the talk, but there we have it. We have most of it. Please, if you have a question, put it in the chat. I guess while people are thinking, let me ask you the first question, Catherine, which is, I guess, a question about the motivation for self-knowledge in St. Augustine, and maybe as contrasted with the ancient thinkers that you talk about. I mean, I guess the question is as simple as how would you characterize the fundamental motivation for pursuing self-knowledge in St. Augustine? I mean, if it's a proper way to characterize that motivation in the ancients as a kind of experience of wonder or experience of perplexity, it seems somewhat different in St. Augustine. It seems a little bit, an experience of, well, as you described it, as kind of finitude and of suffering. So very much not an experience of wonder at the world, but in some sense a concern about the deep suffering of the world that prompts one to ask why. I don't know if you had thoughts about that.
I guess the thoughts I have at the moment would go something like this. I think that one could say that Augustine's starting point has something in common with the tragedies, because the tragedies, as indicated by the name, investigate the source of human suffering. So we begin with the fact of suffering. I also think, however, that Augustine's beginning point, and this is something he talks about briefly in the Confessions, has something in common with Plato and Aristotle, and maybe Plato's most relevant here. And he observes, as they do, that all human beings seek happiness. So he, Augustine, understands himself and all other human beings to be seeking happiness. But he differs, at least as I understand him and Plato, from Socrates, insofar as Augustine doesn't think that human beings can achieve this on earth. They certainly, or we can't achieve it simply with our own faculties and powers, that we need divine assistance. And of course, the wonderful thing from his point of view is that that assistance is available if people seek it. Does that respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I guess, you know, it's a, I wonder why it would lead us to the pursuit of self-knowledge in particular, right? It may lead us to, just a sense of dissatisfaction that we can't achieve it, but why it would ask us to be self-reflexive in the way that human beings particularly are.
Well, I think certainly for Augustine, he does feel dissatisfied. I mean, he's often characterized as a divided soul or a divided self, and he presents himself as torn by many, many different, he calls them wills or desires. And so I think, generalizing hugely, one could say that there is a great overlap between the tragic presentation of human life and actually the Socratic presentation of most human life, which in the Apology he says is not worth living, and Augustine's presentation. All three see human beings torn in different ways, and as long as torn, not successful in satisfying any of their desires. So being torn and being uncomfortable leads people, I think, not only poets and philosophers and theologians, to try to find a satisfactory way of living better, more comfortably. Again, generalizing a lot. For most people, but Alcibiades and Critias can serve as examples here, that leads people to try to accumulate wealth so they'll have protection for another day. It leads them to try to accumulate honors and powers, respect of other human beings, to protect themselves and to make them live more comfortably. What Socrates and Augustine have in common is the insight that that doesn't work. That's just striving after striving after striving. And it's maybe not a satisfactory response to you, but if you look around and ask why human beings do what they do, and if they're happy, you see a lot of unhappy people. Augustine, he was a teacher of rhetoric. He sought wealth and he sought reputation, and he found that didn't make him happy. And so he was looking for something that did. He listened particularly to Bishop Ambrose and found that there was a promise of happiness in Christianity, but he had a lot of intellectual objections to it, so he had to think those through. But what he didn't see was a source of happiness in the external world, and that's why he turned within himself.
Good. So we have Eileen next. Eileen, take it away.
Yes, thanks it was a fascinating paper and a pleasure to read. I have Well, I have more questions, but I'll stick with one which is kind of more practical. Uh, as I'm sure you know, Augustine was very influential on Calvinism, generally speaking, which in turn was very influential on Puritanism. And the Puritans have this, speaking of Augustine confessions, they have these so-called conversion narratives where you have to speak in public about what was going through in your soul and how you got to be converted and so on and so forth. So up to this point, I can see a parallel between Augustine's confessions, which are in writing, but still for the public, right? And the conversions narratives of the Puritans. Nevertheless, for the Puritans, the idea was that once the conversion was approved, you are joining the rank of saints, while Augustine's emphasis is that he's still a sinner. So I was wondering, what can you make? How do you get to from Augustine to the Puritans' conversions narratives?
That's a long story, and I'm not sure that I possess the knowledge to tell it all. I Augustine's confessions are themselves a very original act, and they precede the sacrament. Um, he explains why he's making his confessions public, but I don't think I can trace the history from Augustine to the Catholic institution to the Puritan modification of the Catholic institution in some ways. And I think this is not surprising. I'm more familiar with Augustine's huge influence on Luther, but he doesn't, he's not the only Protestant, and he's not a Puritan. Even in the history as you sketched it briefly, there's a move from public confession, which includes the realization that not only that I am a sinner, but Augustine's very explicit about this. Human beings don't judge. Only God can judge, and we don't have God's knowledge. So one of the characteristics of Augustine's confession that has made them so powerful, and I think have as much influence as they have, is that they are pervaded by this anxiety. He hopes, and he hopes more than he fears. But for him, it's a hope. It's by no means a security. I mean, so he was called a saint by other people, but he doesn't call himself a saint because he doesn't think he's been saved. I mean, he says at the end of the confessions, he talks about what someone in his position caring for a congregation can do. And he can judge the sacraments, he can judge their charity, he can judge whether the people are giving in too much to pleasures, but he cannot determine whether they will be saved. So I think that's the fun. So the Puritans moved back towards Augustine, away from the church sacrament, by making the confession public again. I don't think it's public for quite the same reasons, but I can't defend that. But the difference is he would never say, if you confess, you're guaranteed salvation, because he just doesn't think that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. This kind of like overturning of the entire philosophy, quote unquote, of Catholicism, because the idea was that if you say I'm a saint, the very moment you declare yourself a saint, you just lost your sainthood because you are too proud, so proud that you declare yourself a saint.
Yes,
But on the other hand, just to finish, the idea I was thinking now, I still don't know what to make out of it, but initially in the Catholic Church, there was the idea of public confession, which was eventually dropped for the private confessions has to be private, right? But then if you write a book like Augustine's Confessions, is this is this private or public? I mean, see my point. I mean, it's very difficult to declare, okay, in a certain way it's public, but it still retains something of some sort of privacy in a way. I don't know what you make out of it.
Um, I think what I could say in response to that is that Augustine himself is pretty explicit about why he's giving his confession in public. Because he says, you know, I'm not telling God anything God doesn't know. So then why do I tell this? For it's a way of worshiping God because he's going to show how much God has done for him as he understands it. So it's a kind of offering. What he also says is people are curious about, you know, we never know what's going on inside somebody else's head. So, you know, we'd like to know. So people are curious, but he's not doing this to satisfy their curiosity. And he's also actually not encouraging other people to confess in public the way he has. As I think involved in the Puritan confessions and why the Catholic Church may have made them private is that forcing people to confess in public is a way or can be a way of shaming them. And that's not and shouldn't be the purpose, at least from Augustine's point of view. His purpose is to encourage himself because he constantly feels as if he's not acting properly. He's giving way to desires. He says he himself is particularly subject to the desire for preeminence or fame. So reminding himself of, you know, all the things that he's done that he doesn't particularly want to be famous for is a way of, on the one hand, correcting himself, but on the other hand, reminding himself of God's mercy. So keeping his hope. And he's telling this to other people in order to encourage them to hope as well. But it's always a hope, it's not a security.
Yeah, so you can conclude basically that it served a double purpose for himself and for helping the others.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much.
Next is Alex Duff.
Hey there. I'm just gonna keep my camera off because I'm on a weak connection. I hope you can all hear me though. Catherine, thank you for it's nice to see you.
I wish I could say the same.
Thank you. A wonderful paper, a fascinating discussion. I wonder if I could ask you to say more about the question of form. Toward the end of your paper, you mentioned that Augustine reflects back on some of the early dialogues that he wrote and came to associate the dialogue form with a kind of lingering pride. And I don't know if you use the word aristocratic, but a lingering pride, and therefore maybe we could say a more aristocratic or philosophic approach to knowledge, but that there's something more inherently accessible about the confession, the form of a confession, and the way this has been written. Democratic, I think, was the language you used in your presentation now. Why is it that dialogues are more proud or more aristocratic? I think that's my question.
I think from Augustine's point of view, he was familiar with a lot of schools that were influenced by Plato, or I mean the Epicureans and the Stoics. The schools that encouraged dialogue tended to be formed by wealthy people who had the leisure to discuss ideas. So they had a kind of elitist character, partly because of external conditions. But both right before he converted and right after he converted, Augustine and some of his friends were tempted to form a kind of communist society in which they would share all their property so that they could discuss philosophical questions all day. You know, they'd elect 2 of their members in a rotating fashion. And so drawing off of his experience talking to his friends, right after Augustine converted, he wrote these dialogues. One is with his natural son, Adeodatus. But what he says, so where I got the word pride, is in the Confessions. He himself characterizes his writings at that period. It's not absolutely clear, at least to me, whether he thinks it was proud of him to do all this writing, or that the writing itself was an expression of pride, because when you write, then you're looking for an audience and you're looking for a kind of recognition, generally speaking. When I was thinking about the relation and not between Augustine and Socrates, as you know, Socrates always insists that he needs to talk to individuals, and he needs to do it in private, so they will be honest with themselves and honest with him. Augustine's Confessions, I've read, this of course isn't in the Confessions, that he wrote them with the expectation that they would be read orally to small groups of people, because books were very expensive to publish in those days. And he says he's writing for his fellow citizens, and he uses the word citizens, who are believers. So he's not writing to an individual or any individuals other than their willingness to believe in the God of Scripture, which is more impersonal, but more general, because it goes, and it's intended to go across time and space. And that gives a more general character to his teaching. So he talks about himself as an example, but he's trying to convey, first and foremost, an attitude and a hope. He's not examining arguments per se. So I think he connects, and historically this would be correct, he connects the dialogue form with the small societies in which philosophy was practiced in the ancient world. He sees that those were generally aristocratic. And he also sees that the philosophers that he read, or this is certainly how he understood them, and this was his own experience before he converted, that he was very proud of his knowledge. He thought, age 20, I've mastered Aristotle's categories. Wow.
I know some students like that.
That's a temptation that you shouldn't give into. And so he's trying to overcome that temptation by not asking for applause, but trying to help.
Tremendous. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the answer.
Let's see, Beth is next. Is that Beth Larive? Good to see you if so.
Yes, it's me. I apologize. I'm being like a Rebecca student and calling in from my car. My question actually is, I don't know if it'll be very fruitful, but it continues from Alex's question regarding the form. And so, right, so Augustine, he essentially invents a new literary form, the autobiography, and that is connected to this sort of new thing that's introduced, this turn to subjectivity, which then has sort of vast historical impact throughout the history of thought. And of course, the autobiography is different because of the focus on himself as a subject. And as you point out, the subject then as not just a particular, but a universal in a way, where it's like he represents his own experience as the human experience, and attains self-knowledge through that. And of course, that's different from the Socratic like the Platonic dialogue, because Socrates is shown to be pursuing self-knowledge through talking to other people, dialoguing to other people, whereas Augustine is talking, essentially inquiring of himself. But then I don't know if this goes anywhere, but I kept thinking about this and thinking about Plato writing about Socrates' pursuit of self-knowledge and what it means to write almost 35 dialogue, or many, many, many dialogues about your teacher, and how it's like, Socrates didn't write, so he obviously didn't write an autobiography. Plato's doing biography a little bit more, but in a way, like when you have that extreme of a focus, it's like Plato is kind of inhabiting Socrates, and it almost takes on like an autobiographical cast then, in a way. And like, is that, I don't quite know what my question is, but is there any sort of point of contact that you could see, I guess, fruitfully developed between seeing what Plato is doing with respect to Socrates and what Augustine is doing with respect to himself?
Well, I think there are lots of points of fruitful contact, both because they agree in some ways and they disagree in others. But maybe one way of centering your question would be to begin from the observation that Plato obscures himself in writing the dialogues. So he writes about this person, Socrates, and he always presents Socrates speaking to other described more or less fully individuals. So that's the way in which I think the individual and considerations of the individual enter the Platonic dialogues. Augustine is more radical, one could say, on two fronts. So whereas Plato writes about Socrates and a few other philosophers, Augustine writes about himself. So he first makes himself the primary subject, but then he makes himself the subject, not in terms of his excellences, but in terms of his flaws, or the combination of the flaws. But then, at least as he presents himself in the Confessions, Augustine's hope is to move from this flawed, limited individual whose problems he thinks are shared by other human beings to unity with everything, with the whole. In a sense, that's that particular desire, I think he doesn't, it's not described in the same terms, and it's not altogether the same, but it's rather like Oedipus's desire to encompass everything in order to overcome mortality. So there's something very individualistic about Augustine's attempt also, but the paradoxical effect of it is in a way to wipe away the individual, or that's at least the final goal.
So would you, something like, I'm thinking, Plato looks to another individual and has the effect of, like, I would say, to write about Socrates and make him the subject, he knows Socrates. And it's like he knows himself somehow through knowing Socrates. And those are two particular beings. Whereas for Augustine, by looking to himself and knowing himself, he comes to know the whole. So I wonder if there's like a relation between the method then, and the method of self-knowledge, and then the resulting self-knowledge. It seems like, am I kind of getting at what you're?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a relation between the method or the form of inquiry and the kind of self-knowledge that's being claimed. And I guess let me see, this goes in and out. Relying in this case primarily on the Phaedrus, what I would say is that, Plato's Socrates consistently insists that he has to talk to another human being in order even to find out about himself, what he knows and what he doesn't. But that need on the part of Socrates is, in some ways, it's social. Knowledge is only possible in conjunction with someone else who's inquiring with you. But it's a three-part relation, because you have the two human beings, and then knowledge, or if you want, beauty or virtue, as being the goal they both share. In Augustine, you have a general desire that he observes, which I think actually Plato and Socrates do as well, that all human beings desire happiness. But then why don't human beings succeed in becoming happy? For Augustine, that is because they are mistaken about what they take to be the good. What they need, but what all human beings need, is to learn to love the good, which is God. That is the eternal and that which is beyond us. So you get one goal in principle for all humanity. And that's why I said I thought that Augustine's, and this isn't just me, that Augustine's view is more democratic, because it's, in principle, can be shared by all human beings. That's not to say that he thought it was going to be shared by all human beings, but that in principle it can. But the goal has changed somewhat. Socrates talks about the divine, and knowledge has characteristics in common with the divine, but it doesn't have what's called, not just by Augustine, the personal characteristics of the God of the Bible.
Good. Next, Prabodha.
Hi, Dr. Zuckert and everyone. I thought, as other people have said, your presentation was really fascinating, and I forgive me if I mischaracterize your summary, but it seems like part of the reason God is able to love Augustine so fully is because he fully knows Augustine, and he demonstrates this love and knowledge through providence. But Augustine can't fully know God. So does that mean Augustine and all of humanity cannot fully love God in this life? And sort of related to that, does human love require knowledge, or is belief enough, according to Augustine?
So I think, I guess, so the answer is no, because what Augustine claims to know is he loves God. He's had this experience in which he thinks that all these terrible things that I did, I had a mistress for 14 years or something, and then I left her and son, and turned around and got another mistress where she was always loyal to me. That wasn't good. I don't love myself. But this was all one of the many, he uses the word goads. It was one of the many experiences that God had me undergo, so I could come to understand the truth about God, which is largely Platonic, but goes beyond Plato, precisely in attributing care for the human being. So Augustine, on the basis of his experience, thinks that he has experienced God's love. But that seems to be, there's no reason for it. And so he doesn't claim that he knows God. As he understands God, to the extent to which he understands God, God knows everything. He, Augustine, doesn't claim to know everything, but he does know what he wants, what he desires. And that this union with God is what he most wants for himself and for everybody else. Does that make sense? He knows what he wants or desires or loves, but that's his desire. he doesn't share God's characteristics of eternity and omniscience, so he doesn't, and he couldn't possibly know everything about God.
Yeah, so it seems like a limited amount of knowledge is necessary to love
Right.
God. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Super. Adam Thompson is next.
Thomas, Adam Thomas.
Thomas. Okay, sorry, your name was abbreviated here. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Alex, for inviting me today. I'd like to actually pick up, I guess, on a remark you just made, Catherine, about comparing Plato and Augustine on what we can or can't know about God. They're both interested in limits of knowledge, very much, and I'm wondering if you have a sense of where the difference lies between them in terms of what we can know about God, apart from a special act of grace. And Book 7 has always been very peculiar to me. On the one hand, he talks about the sovereignty of the Logos being somehow demonstrated. On the other hand, his belief in God and belief in his providence or care seems to be a pre-philosophic beginning point that he describes, not one that he reasons himself toward. And also the description of the ascent in Book 7 contains this analysis of the human mind and the work of the intellect, but also an apparent revelation by God in his voice, speaking about his existence to Augustine. Where does that leave us, you think, in terms of the difference between Augustine and Plato and what could be known or not known about the divine?
I guess the brief answer would be that for Plato, I'm trying to go through all the philosophers in my head quickly, but for Plato, the divine is not personal, and partly because it's generally considered to be that which is non-bodily and completely spiritual. Socrates says that the traditional gods, as conceived by the Greeks, there's no reason to believe in gods like that. So there is something that's higher than the human, and that can be called divine, but it doesn't have personal characteristics, and it may or may not have limited powers. For Augustine, he, and in this case, I've read, but it seems to me to be true, that he speaks of knowing the truth, particularly about God, in his heart more than in his head. So he talks a lot more about his feelings than Socrates does, or than I think the other Platonic philosophers do. And he finally locates, that's the source of the truth. That's the locus. He has felt God's love. So yes, his conviction is based on his experience of what he understands to be God's providence. He had to do a lot of study and engage in a lot of philosophical arguments to come to understand how his own experience could be recast in terms of divine providence. That wasn't the way he initially felt about it or understood it. That's the truth via hindsight. So that I think the understanding of the divine is significantly different. And also the way in which one approaches or doesn't approach the divine is also different. I mean, Socrates talks about eros and Augustine talks about love. And it seems as if via Plotinus, Augustine was pretty aware of parts of the Symposium at least, but they're not the same.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Let me ask everyone that is going to ask a question, try to keep it as brief as you can so we can get through the queue, and maybe if you can restrain yourself, no follow-ups. Let me recognize Sebastian Graham next.
Hello, Professor Zuckert. My question is after comparing Augustine and Socrates, does Socrates come off a little bit better? He presents as a being that doesn't need a god to moderate himself, and he's far more successful at it, not only moderating his more carnal desires, but also moderating himself in, a very skillful retreat, right? And then in addition to this, we have to, Alcibiades says that he's full of moderation and hubris. This is kind of an interesting thing. And then the last thing I'd kind of point to is through Alcibiades' claims of him being able to kind of animate or move human beings however he desired through his speeches. How might this be skewed as like knowing the human heart? And at the end of the day, how Socrates might, as the philosophical man, present as a superior model than the theological man. Thank you.
Okay. I think you have to take your pick. So with regard to Socrates, I take fairly seriously what Socrates says in his last speech in the Apology, when he says, if I tell you the story about the Delphic Oracle, the jurors are going to think I'm being ironic, so dissimulating, and they do, they make noises, etc. But if I tell you that it is a very great good for human beings to spend their lives talking to each other in conversations, examining their opinions and including his, about what is a truly excellent human life. That is the only human life that's worth living. The others are not. So I think, in effect, there's what Socrates is saying in pretty hard terms is the chorus at the end of Oedipus at Colonus that says, best not to be born, better to die young, because human life is suffering. That is characteristic of almost all actual human existence. There's one and only one exception, and that's to live a life of philosophy as I, Socrates, practice it. It's perfectly clear only a few people can do that, if any, after Socrates and Plato. So that's very restricted. And the rest of us are doomed to chase and chase and chase and chase after wealth and honor and to fear death. So Socrates is more optimistic than the tragedians about the possibilities of human life, but very restricted optimism. Augustine opens, this is the Platonism for the people. Augustine opens the possibility of achieving happiness to everybody. Doesn't have a solid foundation. The foundation is belief, it's not knowledge. But it's possible for an uneducated person like his mother, Monica. In some ways, it's more possible for that kind of person reading the Bible than it is for a highly educated and intelligent person like Augustine, who could always find difficulties with what he read. So you have to choose. I don't think it's quite so clear on the surface, particularly if you throw in to Socrates, not just the Apology, but also the Phaedrus, when he shows in the central speech, his Palinode, that there are all kinds of different human beings, and these different human beings are moved by different dominant desires. Only a few can be philosophers. And in order to become a philosopher, you have to find your soulmate, somebody who has the same sort of desire for knowledge, in this case, particularly, or first of the beautiful, but it could be of the just, or that you do. But because there's so many different kinds, it's not clear anybody will find his or her soulmate. So yes, it's possible to live a happy, satisfying life in principle, but it's very, very, very rare. For Augustine, you have to believe, but the chances are arguably better. And it's certainly more inclusive, to use the language of the day.
Good. Next is Ann Ward. Hi, Ann. Good to see you.
Hi. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. I can't see you.
I'm trying to get my video on. Oh,
well,
sorry. I'm at my laptop at home, so I can't seem to get my video on.
It doesn't matter. I have these pop-ups that come, and they were obscuring your name.
I think I got it on this. Okay, so I'm on the phone because I have to phone in. So my question, I'm trying to keep it brief. Thank you. Has to do with Augustine's, particularly Augustine's Catholicism in relation to his understanding of self-knowledge. And I very much appreciated your paper and your talk, and actually talking about him as a Catholic. Because I guess my question, so for example, I enjoyed your discussion in Book 7, the Neoplatonists get him to turn inward to the Logos, so he reflects on his own reason, he has Platonic ecstasy, and he catches an intellectual glimpse of that which is. So he comes to an intellectual acceptance of the Christian God. But because of the requirements of continence, he can't convert fully. And that comes in Book 8. And when you're reading, you think continence is something like Aristotle's sophrosune, a mean desire for pleasure between excess and deficiency. But it becomes clear when Augustine is struggling in the garden, where he has his final sort of like a reminiscence of the Garden of Gethsemane, please take this cup from me. But he's in the garden and he's struggling. That for him, continence, and he gets a vision of continence, means celibacy. And not all Catholics, so the Simplianus himself who's telling the story is married, but he's telling the story of the two Roman civil servants who convert and their fiancés become virgins. So I think it means celibacy. So he's not just converting, he's going to become a priest. And I think, when I think of that, I think that's not, Aristotle would consider that an extreme, a vice, not a mean. And so even more immoderate than his previous life of, let's say, lasciviousness, having mistresses. Celibacy is even more extreme. And that's the struggle that he realizes he has to give up sex. And I'm just wondering, and wouldn't that make Augustine's Catholic understanding of knowledge of God, knowledge of self, very different from, let's say, the understanding of Socrates' knowledge of self, Sophocles, Oedipus? None of them think that's required. And so I'm wondering, I think in the Confessions that really comes out, is celibacy, which today is still a requirement in Catholic Church, is it just an historical contingency? Augustine at that time thought the best way for a human being, you can't have full knowledge of God, but to come closest to God and knowledge of the self is the celibate life. Or is there something more central to Augustine's understanding in that, which would make it not more difficult, let's say, to reconcile with the classical understanding of self-knowledge? That's my question, sorry.
And that's a hard question. So to begin at the lower level, I talk about his conversion to Catholicism because in the Confessions, he says that the Manichaeans talked about God and Christ. So Catholics were not the only kinds of Christians at his time. And he was becoming a specific kind of Christian. So he converted to Catholicism. I really am not in a position to say what Catholic doctrine is, but every woman's understanding is that it does parallel Augustine's at the beginning. So at the beginning of his Confessions, Augustine is very critical of his parents because when he became an adolescent, he had these drives. And so he thought they were indifferent to his eternal damnation because they didn't arrange for him to get an early marriage so he could deal in a legitimate way with his desires. So he dealt with them in an illegitimate way. But that from his point of view, marriage is okay, but you can't live a life entirely devoted to the service of God. This has to do with the singular focus of Augustine's notion of love of God. If you have a spouse whom you love and you have to then serve also, and there are a lot of other duties that come in line. That's the reason why ultimately he doesn't even form a small community the way Socrates did. It's a little unclear to me because, yes, Augustine is definitely talking about celibacy. And he's also talking about minimizing the amount you eat and minimizing the amount you drink. That is, you're supposed to reduce to the absolute lowest amount any source potentially of physical pleasure that you might have. So yes, you have to eat in order to stay alive. Yes, you have to drink to stay alive, but there's that temptation always to take a little bit more because it tastes good. And that's certainly not Socratic. I would agree with you. And it's kind of on both sides. So Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle on the one side, and now reading Montaigne on the other. This looks to be immoderate from the other points of view. Augustine recognizes, he didn't think that he himself could do it. He recognizes that other people can't do it. But to the extent to which they can't do it, they are further away from God and therefore further away from the source of their happiness. So yeah, it's very extreme.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Next is Professor Minkoff.
Yeah, this is quite amazing to have these meetings. That never happens before, otherwise. With so many people across the globe, though I guess you don't invite people from so a bit more textual.
You could invite people. Yeah.
I mean, why don't you invite people?
Sure.
It's too late in China. Heidegger. I've been reading Heidegger, and Heidegger seems withering about Augustine, though he also kind of likes the historicism that comes out of it, existentialism, historicism. But in summarizing the actual chapters, and it just sounds to me like he's withering. That just read two sentences that Augustine wants to dare confess himself. That's about chapter 10. The book is it book 10 or chapter 10? And he'll confess. What's that?
Yeah, well, I think they're books, but at any rate, it's part of the Confessions, right?
Yeah, it was the one about memory.
Yes.
And he will confess what he knows about himself. Of course, Augustine doesn't put it in quotation marks, but maybe Heidegger does. But he admits not knowing himself. He wants to confess that too. But one thing is certain: he loves God. But what is God? And he almost asked that question right at that point. I guess it is chapter 6 of book 10 of the Confessions. Then he turns back to himself. I'm just trying to understand this part of how it works. Then he turns back to himself and his own soul, and that there is a soul, not just a body. And then he says, "What is it that I love?" Goes back to the question, what is it that is better than what I find in myself? And this is already something one can question, but when he turns to nature in that section, says, well, is it nature? Nature tells him, when he's just quoting Psalms, oh, it's not me. We're very beautiful, but it's not us. Nature is not good enough. And that, all of that, and I don't know if it's just Heidegger's reading that affected me, all of that seemed so hasty, and he was going over, maybe he's justifying it elsewhere. For example, that rejection of nature, it happens in 2 sentences based on a quotation from the Psalms. So, and surely there's more to it than that. What is it?
So I guess you're reading Heidegger's well, the lectures.
That course you referred to as well. I think summer of
Religion.
21.
So in the part that you're reading from, Heidegger is summarizing parts of book 10.
Yeah.
And what Augustine is doing in the parts that you've read about is he says, well, I looked into my memory. And then he goes through the different kinds of beings. So he begins with the things that he senses, the things in the world. And what Augustine says about them is they tell him that they're not God, why they're beautiful. So it's the beauty. I mean, this is a kind of the Platonism that Heidegger wouldn't like, but that's very strong in Augustine. The beauty of the world tells him that they have a good cause, but they are not self-caused. They had a maker. Now, he doesn't prove that they had a maker. It's just that they are not God, which is what he's looking for. Augustine, he said earlier, he and other human beings love the beautiful. Well, what is it, the beautiful that we love? And one of the general temptations, in fact, the way the carnal pleasures give rise to the third temptation, to the second temptation, which is curiosity or search for knowledge, which is human beings regularly, from Augustine's point of view, mistake the good things or the beautiful things for the good and the beautiful themselves. And locating the good and the beautiful in things, they don't look to the source of the good and the beautiful, which is God. So what Augustine is doing there is he's not so much proving things, he's just saying, I look for God first in the world, the things that I sense, because this is in my memory. I have all kinds of memories of things that I've sensed. I'm not going to get the order of all the things. So he thinks that he looks at the world first, then he looks at other animals, then he looks at the soul. Well, animals have souls too, they have senses, etc. So that's not God. He looks to the things that are in his memory that he knows that don't come from his senses, that aren't in the world. All the things that he's learned, they too aren't God. And he tries to give an account of everything he thinks he has in his mind, which paradoxically also includes the memory of having forgotten something. And then he says, well, but so he can't understand everything in the memory. He doesn't know all the things in his memory. Why doesn't he know it? Because why does he seek knowledge? What is he doing? Well, he's seeking happiness. And in seeking knowledge, he decides that some things are true and false. Well, how is he able to make that decision? This is the part that kind of echoes the theory of recollection, but it's not the same. So what Augustine concludes is there are all kinds of different things or conceptions of different things in his memory, but none of them can explain its own origin or source. So he has to go through his memory in order to see that God is something that's outside of his memory and outside his knowledge. Now that's a move that's both, I think, both comfortable and not for Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger is very comfortable because the whole thing about being in time means that for us to have knowledge, it has to have limits. And then we don't know the being of the beings, which is beyond that. That's mysterious. So Heidegger makes in his own thought a kind of parallel move to the one that Augustine does here. But of course, Heidegger defines that source of everything differently, or understands that source of everything differently than Augustine does.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Good. So we have 12 minutes left. So I thought what we could do is just bundle the last few questions. So I have remaining on the queue, Robert Wiley, Dustin Gish, and Ken Leah Barnes. So if you could go in that order. So Robert Wiley, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, then I'll have Dustin ask.
Hi, Catherine. Good to see you. Thanks for your
Hi,
paper.
Rob.
I was interested at the end of your paper in some distinctions you were making, where you argue that Augustine claims to love God, but only seeks to know him. And then that Augustine's love for God is not because he glimpses something beautiful about God, as in Phaedrus Symposium, but because he wishes to reciprocate the love that God feels for him. I was interested in these distinctions for two reasons. One, Augustine writes in Against Faustus that one doesn't enter into knowledge, a certain kind of knowledge, except through love, non intrater in veritatem nisi precarita. Because to know something without love is to wish to instrumentalize it or use it. And so love opens up this different way of knowing things. I take that to be something interesting we can learn from Augustine. And then I was also wondering about the distinction between if feeling the love of God and sort of understanding its sheer gratuity, the distinction between that and glimpsing something, and sort of how do we separate that out from glimpsing something beautiful about, if we can speak this way, I don't know, the soul of God. And how we can, so this distinction between loving and knowing, is there such a distinction for Augustine, or how might that work? And then the distinction between feeling God's love that we assume is totally gratuitous and distinguishing that from glimpsing something beautiful about God.
And Dustin.
Yes, it may be a, hi everyone. Hi, Catherine, thank you very much. The question may be to grand, I'm sure, but maybe just a simple response or your thoughts on this. I'm wondering how you see the essential relation between Augustine's self-examination in books 1 through 10 as a kind of means to self-sacrifice and turning his will over to God on the one hand, and then his turn to scriptural exegesis in the final 3 books. Do you see an essential relation between those two activities, the self-examination on the one hand and the exegesis on the other?
Well done, Dustin. Very, very brief. Okay. Can Leah Barnes, go ahead.
Hi, Kinley. Hi, I was just wondering if you were referencing the forms when you wrote that Augustine perceives that he could not seek knowledge of God if his memory did not contain some sense of what he was seeking. So I was just seeing if you could elaborate more on that.
Okay, so can I do this? I'm not sure. With regard to the difference between love and knowledge, it seems to me that Augustine differentiates them, and the difference, at least as I understand it, is that the love is directed to something that I desire, or in this case also that I'm grateful to, but that I don't entirely understand. So in the first case, it's his experience of it is a kind of state, but it's temporary. He doesn't know that permanent state, and he also doesn't claim to know the source of the, I think you would call it, grace that he's received. You asked me a second question, Robin. Right now, I'm blanking on that. But somehow I think that it is that for Augustine, the perception of the truth isn't entirely cognitive or intellectual. It is also a matter of feeling or heart. And that, at least as I understand, is something he takes out of the Bible. To Dustin, at least I understand the relation between the Augustine's account of his own development and then the discussions of time and the beginning of Genesis at the end of the Confessions in the following way. Augustine has given an account of what he thinks is the truth about himself and what he is doing. And that account, or his account of his conversion to Catholicism, depends crucially in his own account on his reading of the Platonists because they gave him the understanding of God as purely spiritual and not corporeal. And that was absolutely essential for him. But having that adopted that understanding of God, Augustine then confronts the question, that's the old Platonic question to a certain extent, of the relation between his and other sensible things being in the world of becoming and that God. So that leads him into the investigation of time. And his perception of the difference between the temporal character of human existence and the eternity of God also leads him to face a problem, because in Genesis it says, in the beginning, God created. And so the words of scripture make it sound as if God's acting in time. So I see and there are critics of the confessions who say they don't go together. I see the end as Augustine's showing us now that these are the kinds of questions he has to face on the basis of what he's come to know about himself in the first books. And he faces them as questions. I mean, he really, in the end, claims very limited knowledge, but these are the things we have to ask. Because if we love God, then don't we want to understand him as best we can? And we try that through our own investigations, but then we also have God's word, so we have to try to make sense of scriptures. That was a real problem for Augustine. It was a reason why he didn't become a Catholic initially, because he thought, I mean, these stories, who can believe them? And that was the role of Ambrose in his development. Ambrose said, well, you don't have to deal with them literally. That's my interpretation. And finally, on Augustine's reference to the forms, I don't think that Augustine is actually referring to the forms per se. This is actually one of the many things I think Heidegger took out of Augustine, because Heidegger talks about the Physik. That is, but it's the problem of the Meno, and maybe that's for me the clearest way. Meno asked Socrates, how can you seek knowledge of virtue if you don't know what virtue is? This is ridiculous. And so Augustine says, well, we make decisions all the time about what's true and not true. Where do we get this idea of the truth? That is somehow inside us. We have it, but it only becomes explicit when we start asking about it or using a faculty. But if we didn't have some notion that we didn't know that we had until we bring it into play, we couldn't do this. But we know that we do it.
Wonderful. Well, we're just about at 3:30, so let me say thank you, Catherine, so much for doing this. Wonderful presentation, wonderful talk. Can we give a round of applause? Yeah, Rebecca's given the electronic round of applause.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.